Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order, and then we rank them from best to worst. My name's Ben.
And I'm Sarah.
Thank you for listening to us today. How are you doing today, Sarah?
Well, Daddy-O, doing better than last week. I just want to give a really big thank you to our listeners who are the most understanding, amazing people. We didn't do an episode last week. We took a mental health break because I had a breakdown on the couch, and it was all right. I'm doing better, but we are back and ready for action, ready to have a blast. And why are you looking at me like that?
Is that a Beatnik slang dictionary?
Maybe.
Are you trying to on the fly insert Beatnik phrases into what you're saying?
I'm not that much of a square.
I think you're going to have a hard time trying to do that on the fly.
Listen, I'm a cool cat. I'm down and hip. I'm with the jazz, man. Let's get into it. What are we watching today?
So today we are watching Bucket of Blood from 1959, directed by Roger Corman. It is it is themed around the beat scene of the late 1950s, which was kind of like the cool, rebellious, teen rebel leftist culture movement of the time, the hipsters of their day.
Yeah, it was quite boss.
Do you want to talk a bit about what Beatniks are?
Yeah, I think we can noodle it out.
So
the look you are giving me. Don't be such a cube.
Is a cube worse than a square?
Yeah, because you're in 3 dimensions, you know?
I see. Yeah, I mean, what's funny about Beatniks to me is that the stereotypical image of one has somehow managed to continue as a stock character for as long as it has. Like the fact that and I know that this isn't exactly a modern reference either, but the fact that Max and his friends go to a beat club in the late 90s extremely goofy sequel or whatever is wild to me. But yeah, if you're not sure what the hell we're talking about, if you're not getting what we're putting down, if you've ever seen a stock comedy character of a guy all in black with a goatee and a beret, smoking a cigarette and saying spoken word poetry over someone doing a bongo drum, that's the stereotype beatnik.
Yeah, it's gas.
But as with many things, there's much more to it than the stereotypes. So I'll turn it over to English major Sarah over here.
Yeah, let's dig into it. So the beat poets, the beat generation, I think you can kind of tie down to 3 major guys. There's more, but I'm just going to be talking about these 3 guys: Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs, and Allen Ginsberg. Mm-hmm. So they all met in the mid-1940s, and they would develop this kind of literary style, subculture, and genre themes in literature that would be kind of described as the beat movement. You can see how it grows out of feelings from the Lost generation that had Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, coming out of that disillusionment of the world wars, and just a heck of a lot of influence of jazz. Which is why some of those slang words, you might go well, wait a minute, haven't I really heard that with being associated with African-American vernacular English? And it's yes, because for a very long time, white people have been stealing slang. It was Kerouac who came up with the phrase beat generation. And by that, he doesn't mean beats as in music. He means it in the sense of people who are beaten down and down on their luck.
I didn't know that, actually. I always associated it as like musical beats.
Well, like I can see where that would come from because of the tie to jazz music, but no, it's definitely more like being like, ooh, I want in on like the fun stuff that happens with sex and drugs and poverty. You know, the very fun experience of poverty.
Right, hanging around with the common people.
So Kerouac would describe this beat generation as, quote, a generation of crazy, illuminated hipsters suddenly rising and roaming America, serious, bumming and hitchhiking everywhere, ragged, beatific, and beautiful in an ugly, graceful new way. And it's very humorous to me that he uses the phrase hipster to describe these people, because that is 40 odd years, 40 to 50 years before I would hear it in university. So these people are down and out, they're beaten down, but they are still full of like intense conviction, is kind of how he would describe these people. They aren't juvenile delinquents, but he uses the phrase, they are rather solitary Bartleby's. Do you know what Bartleby the Scrivener is?
Yes.
Okay. For those who aren't familiar, Bartleby the Scrivener is a short story by Herman Melville from like 1853. And it's basically this guy named Bartleby who works in like an office. And when he's asked to do things, he replies, "I'd prefer not to." And so that idea of like you're having to engage in the contemporary culture, but would prefer not to, like you're there in body, but not in spirit, rebelling in spirit because you would prefer not to. And it's not that you are like wanting to blow stuff up. You're just like, I would prefer not to do this.
Yeah, it's like if there was a spectrum that went from Ernest Hemingway to Dennis Hopper, and you threw like a dart right in the middle of that spectrum, I feel like you hit Beat Generation.
Sure.
Like it's halfway between Lost Generation and the hippie movement, but like the connection there is it's all counterculture, and the counterculture part of it tends to still be very similar.
Absolutely. No, you hit the nail on the head, because literally like without the Beatniks, you don't get to the psychedelic era of the 60s. But it also comes out of the Lost Generation with Hemingway. I think it's also like kind of interesting with the Beat Generation is that like that's wholly American. The Lost Generation were Americans in Europe.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting for that. So there's three main things that are kind of pointed out with the Beat Generation of sex, drugs, and I'll say poverty, but it's really like anti-consumerism is kind of what they mean by poverty.
Yeah. Not being part of the system,
exactly.
man.
You can kind of tie those to these three individuals.
So each one is one of these things.
Basically, that's why I chose these three. So starting with William S. Burroughs, he's an author, and he is also known for being a heroin addict. And I bring this up because a lot of his work is tied to his experience with that addiction. His very first novel was 1953's Junkie. It was semi-autobiographical. But his third novel, which came out in 1959 and probably made the biggest splash, is Naked Lunch. Now, Naked Lunch is very experimental. They're more than vignettes, but shorter than a collection of short stories. And it's very like a stream of consciousness kind of story.
Is Naked Lunch with like the cut up technique?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can read these vignettes in any order. And when it came out, it was considered obscene, both in language and content, because there was sadism, there was discussion of sexuality, there was addiction, there was child murder, there was pedophilia. It was a big controversy when it came out. But it's also like one of the last times that there was a trial about obscene literature.
Right.
Now, the other thing that Burroughs kind of points to is besides being a heroin addict, the other thing in his life that he points to as having a major impact on his life and his inspiration for writing is that in 1951, he killed his second wife, Joan Vollmer. And he points to that as well as his addiction and using writing to move through those things as big inspirations for how writing is like magic and having these short bursts of vignettes as short spells to kind of get things out of your system.
Men will do anything to avoid going to therapy.
You could say that about everyone on this list, my love. Next, I'm going to talk about Allen Ginsberg.
Are you going to just just mosey on past William S. Burroughs killed his wife? Because I feel like that's a heck of a thing to just sort of drop and then just leave there as a little breadcrumb.
It's not incredibly relevant, but to put it out there. So he had his first story when telling police is that they were down in Mexico and he was trying to do like a William Tell kind of stunt with his revolver. Everyone was drunk, of course, and that stunt did not go well. Later, he had a story that he was showing the revolver to his friends, dropped it, and it went off and shot Joan. So he was in Mexico and he kind of stayed around there because he was tried in absentia for manslaughter and murder in the States. And so he did end up having to serve 2 years. So Allen Ginsberg, he is an author, more specifically a poet, and he is where the sex comes in with tying it to Beatnik or the Beat generation. They didn't really like the term Beatnik. And the piece of literature I'm going to call out here is Ginsberg's Howl, which is a very long poem, came out in 1956, and it also had an obscenity trial because it uses sexual and obscene language and has many descriptions of sexual acts with many different genders. And perhaps most galling of all has descriptions of casual sex. One particular great quote from it that I really enjoy is Ginsberg praising the kind of guy who lounged hungry and lonesome, seeking jazz or sex or soup. Howl is wild. When it came out, Ginsberg's publisher had to face charges of publishing pornography, but they were able to fight against it because of a judge ruling but there's something of social value here, so we're going to make this go away. And Ginsberg in Howl, it's all a poem, but it uses what's called spontaneous prose, which Ginsberg borrowed basically that style from Kerouac. Jack Kerouac is known for that spontaneous prose. That's his bread and butter. He is an author, probably best known for 1957's On the Road, where different beat figures, including Ginsberg and Burroughs, are featured as different characters in the book. Kerouac himself is Sal Paradise in the book. So while it was published in 1957,
and this is my nom de plume, Johnny Cool.
That's exactly it. There's someone whose name is Carlos Marx. We're all having fun here.
Right.
While On the Road was published in 1957, it came out of a lot of notebooks that he kept through the 40s, and he would type On the Road over 3 weeks on a single roll of paper on his typewriter, which might sound weird, but it's because that's the performance part of the piece. And indeed, the Beat generation, as Kerouac named it, was very much focused on trying to bring into literature the improvisational fluidity that you would see in jazz, and performance is a big part of that. Now, before I move on to more of the Beat generation, I just want to describe On the Road for you a little bit.
Sure, yeah.
So it follows Sal Paradise and his friend Dean Moriarty, traveling across the U.S. through different times in their life, bumming on couches, being on drugs, having sex, listening to jazz all along the way. knocking up different women and then leaving them and then going back to their wives and knocking them up and then being like, I'm out of here, and going back on the road because the road calls to them, Ben. The road is where it's at.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like Ginsberg and Kerouac and Burroughs like are like two things. One, they are well in the category of what we call today problematic faves. And the other is, if you have been to university, you have guaranteed to have met a guy who takes himself way too seriously who loves these dudes.
Yes.
Yes.
So the Beat Generation, you can see having these defining characteristics about being anti-consumerist, anti-materialist, wanting to like question authority, being like anti-war, anti-authority, trying to expand your mind through marijuana or other drugs, and even later on getting into Buddhism or other Eastern religions and trying to bring in aspects of that.
Yeah, which is all like stuff that then bled into the hippie movement.
Yeah.
I did read somewhere someone commenting on the Beat Generation saying like, by today's standards, it's very mild rebellion, but the 1950s were like such a button down consumerist conformist time that even like a little rebellion was viewed as like the end of civilization as we know it.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, beatnik is kind of the term that like mainstream society put onto this group. They were like, we're the Beat Generation, and the moms and pops at home were like, well, you're just beatniks. That stereotype and stereotypical look would typically be the goatees that you described, dark rimmed round glasses, berets, playing the bongos. For women, it was often straight cropped hair, black tights. And so at best, these people, the stereotype when shown in media would be like a farce, a comedic figure, something to kind of laugh at.
Yeah.
You could even point to Shaggy from Scooby-Doo as being a beatnik.
Yeah, and like that stereotype that you're talking about, like it's one of those fascinating things. I'm always fascinated with stereotypes that are extremely specific and also absolutely unchanging, because it to me means like it just sends me down a rabbit hole of trying to like track down like where each individual thing comes from, because it is like it's every movie that does a beatnik scene. It's like it's a smoky coffee house. There's a serious dude in a beret and sunglasses and a goatee. He's got a scroll of paper that he's reading like blank verse poetry off of while like a jazz band plays the bongos. And then just like off to the side, there's some woman with short hair in black leotards just sort of like flailing about, dancing, like barefoot maybe. And it's just like such a specific set of imagery.
Yeah, so part of why Kerouac later didn't like the term the Beat Generation is because of it being I don't want to say co-opted, but like the idea of, and that look of beatnik being so tied to what they were actually doing. And so he was like, we're just getting defined, man. I don't like these labels.
Right.
Kind of pushing against it.
And the word beatnik is even like it's not just like what the moms and pops call them. It's kind of meant to be like a put down.
Absolutely.
Because like the Nick part of it, and like if you didn't know this from things like Dr. Robotnik and other stuff that has that like ending, but that's coming from Sputnik, the Russian satellite from 1957. And I feel like the taking beat and Nick and putting it together is kind of like, yeah, we're putting you down, and we're also like vaguely insinuating that you're a bunch of commies. Which
is hilarious because there's nothing about communism in any of this.
Right.
It's all just like, it's counterculture. It's not communism.
But, the 50s were a time when anything counterculture did get labeled as communist. Like there were people calling Elvis Presley's hip gyrations when he danced communist.
So at best, these stereotypes would be that comedic kind of figure. At worst, you had serial rapists, such as in the 1959 film noir The Beat Generation, directed by Charles Haas, where a beatnik stalks and rapes married women including the wife of the lead detective who is trying to figure out who this beatnik is. And this wife, after that attack, conceives and is trying to decide, do I have an abortion? What do I do with this child? Eventually, the detective catches the beatnik and is like beating him up and is going to kill him, and then goes like, no, I'm an upstanding moral person. I will not kill this serial rapist. And so he catches the beatnik, and then it ends with the wife giving birth, and all is well again in the social order. It was a budget of $439,000, and it made at the box office $750,000.
Mm-hmm.
That's fucking wild. And while we will not be watching that movie for the podcast because it is a film noir, that came out this year, right? 1959.
Yeah.
So these are the two stereotypes of the beat generation and beatniks that are in the culture right now.
I feel like it's sort of a similar thing that you see even today, where the group that you're supposed to be afraid of, or like it's the beatniks got turned into like something to sensationalize and use as like a scare tactic, the same way that like the rock and rollers had been, the same way that the hippies would be, the same way that like woke activists and Antifa are treated now. And it's like, it's that same rhetorical device of like the enemy must be simultaneously like ridiculous and silly and stupid, but also like threatening and scary, right?
Yes.
You have to feel a superiority complex over them, while at the same time you need to put more money into the police department to deal with them.
But I also wanted to mention that film because I have a feeling our friend Roger Corman is taking some inspiration from it.
Well, I think 1959 must have been the moment when the beat scene had its mainstream like kind of breakthrough, or maybe had its mainstream breakthrough like a year or 2 years earlier, and now this is when all the movies that they decided to make about it were coming out.
Well, this is the year that Naked Lunch comes out, so
Right.
it's in the news.
Yeah, so this is like the peak of that movement. And so there were a number of these kind of overly sensationalistic, almost like exploitation, beatsploitation movies coming out in 1959. There was Beat Generation. There was also a movie called The Rebel Set, which is about a bunch of beatniks who like go rob a bank and have car chases and shit. And like that stereotypical scene that we described is like in all of these movies. Like that's just what these people are. And Bucket of Blood, the movie we are watching tonight, is the same thing. However, there is something that makes Bucket of Blood very different from Beat Generation and Rebel Set, which are both much more like straight on crime drama, like Be Afraid of the Rebel Teens kind of movies. And that is that Bucket of Blood is a comedy.
Okay.
Now, it is a horror comedy, but like I'm going in here telling you right up front, it's a black comedy. And so why are we watching it for an episode of the show? For one thing, I'm curious to have a discussion with you to see if you think there's enough horror in it to rank. But also, Bucket of Blood is like a fulcrum moment in Roger Corman's career and kind of changes his style of movie making. And that leads to later horror comedies and black comedies and kind of a more tongue-in-cheek attitude from Roger Corman in the future, most notably The Little Shop of Horrors, which like Little Shop of Horrors is straight up just a comedy. And it's something where I really want to cover that movie for the show, but it would definitely be for like a horror adjacent episode. Whereas this movie's kind of the beginning of that branching off. And so similar to kind of what we've done in the past with movies like Godzilla or Dark Eyes of London, or like these movies where horror branched off into something else, I kind of want to cover this movie as that branching off point.
Cool.
So it has been a while since we checked in with our good pal, Roger Corman. The last picture we saw from him that was written and directed by him was 1957's The Undead, back in episode 205. What episode is this?
This is 281.
Holy smokes, we're getting up there. So The Undead is currently ranked at number 118 on the list, which I think we're at, 270-something movies?
I would guess 281 because that's how many episodes we have, Ben.
I know it's less than that. Since The Undead, Corman has directed a noir called Teenage Doll, a rock and roll musical called Carnival Rock, an exploitation picture called Sorority Girl, the adventure movie The Saga of the Viking Women and Their Voyage to the Waters of the Great Sea Serpent, the sci-fi picture War of the Satellites, the prehistoric adventure movie Teenage Caveman, the true crime drama Machine Gun Kelly, the adventure movie She Gods of Shark Reef, and the film noir I, Mobster. He also produced Night of the Blood Beast, which we covered in episode 248 and is currently ranked at number 103. He also produced Crybaby Killer, which was like a teen exploitation movie and also the film debut of Jack Nicholson, and Stakeout on Dope Street, which was the directorial debut of Irvin Kershner. So he's been a busy guy.
Yes.
In the last 2 years. Machine Gun Kelly starred Charles Bronson, and it was like his first starring role.
Oh, sweet, because we saw him all the way back in House of Wax.
And it's based on like a real mobster. And it was the first film of Corman's to get good critical reviews.
Oh my God.
And it attracted attention in like film journals like Cahiers du Cinéma in France, which was like the beginning of like critics really looking at things like auteur theory and stuff like that. And they were seeing Corman as like a unique voice in American cinema. You know, so Corman's like getting critical attention and praise for the first time in his career. I, Mobster, which is his movie right before this, was released in January 1959, and it had a budget of $500,000 and was shot in CinemaScope for 20th Century Fox. Like, it was a real movie. And Variety praised that film for its elements of black humor.
Ah, I see the connection now.
Yeah. So in January of 1959, Corman and his brother Gene founded the Film Group. That's Film Group, all one word. You know, got to get that SEO.
I didn't have SEO back then, Ben. There's no SE to O.
The Film Group was a company specializing in producing and distributing low-budget films for drive-ins and grindhouse theaters. And so this was Corman like deciding to get into the distribution part of the game as well. But also, Corman could make films cheaper through Film Group than at AIP, because AIP, you see, used union crews.
Ah.
And Film Group did not.
The only union here is group.
Yeah. Film Group used things like film students.
Oh, no.
You know,
oh, sure. They have a chock full of them down in LA now.
Yeah.
In 1959.
Yeah. And we'll talk about some of the film students who, you know, came up through the Corman Film School, but I just mentioned one of them, Irvin Kershner. So anyways, this movie is not a Film Group movie, but I sort of threw in that. But, you know, just to let you know where Corman's at right now. In spring 1959, AIP approached Corman asking for a horror movie. Hey, man, it's time to do another one. However, they did have 3 stipulations on him. He had $50,000 to shoot it. He had 5 days to shoot it in.
Oh my God.
And he had to reuse sets from Diary of a High School Bride.
Okay. I mean, those aren't outlandish asks.
So the fastest that Corman had shot a movie at this point was 6 days.
Okay, so maybe one outlandish ask.
And he thought to himself, all right, that sounds like an interesting challenge. And basically kind of agreed to do it on like almost treating it like a dare.
Oh my God.
Like, you need to bring this movie in under $50,000 in 5 days. But he was not really interested in doing another horror picture. He found that kind of boring. So he met up with his regular screenwriter, Charles Griffith, and, they decided to talk out like, well, what can we do to make this different? And Griffith pitched Corman on the idea of doing a satirical black comedy about beatniks. And, it's 1959. These are guys in their late 20s, early 30s who live in LA. Like,
they know what beatniks are.
Yeah, like they're hanging around this scene. Now, as I mentioned, the films like Beat Generation and Rebel Set that came out in this same year were very sensationalistic, very much treated beatniks as like a source of crime and corruption, but also as unknowable, rebellious teens talking in nonsense slang, like very much similar to the teen movies we saw a couple years earlier in the decade, where it was like, they're rebelling, but who could possibly say what they're rebelling against? It doesn't make any sense. And the words they use are nonsense, and you can't understand them because it's just silly bullshit, right? Like that kind of attitude. But Griffith wanted to do something different. He wanted to basically do a kind of like knowing satire. Like these were guys who had vaguely beatnik friends that they wanted to sort of poke fun at. Corman, however, was really anxious about the idea of trying comedy. Basically, what he said to Griffith was that, like, he doesn't want to do comedy because to do comedy, you have to be good. And they don't have the time or money to be good. Because in order to be good, you have to either spend time or money, and they don't have either of those. So, like, it's better to just stick with action and, like, with straight horror or straight whatever, because, then you can just shoot it and it's fine. Griffith's counter argument to Corman was that the movie had such a low budget that, like, they couldn't lose, basically.
They couldn't lose?
Like, the argument was, like, that they were spending so little money on this that, like, the movie had to make a profit.
Oh, just through
like the numbers game, basically. it was like, Griffith's argument was like, this is extremely low stakes. So like, what have you got to lose by trying?
I mean, that's a really good argument.
Corman
Do you want to live forever?
Right, exactly. So Corman and Griffith then spent a day hitting up beat coffee houses, observing the scene, spitballing the story back and forth to one another. And for the core of the like horror movie structure that they were going to hang their beat satire on, they basically took inspiration from Mystery of the Wax Museum and its remake House of Wax. So this is basically a House of Wax remake, but about beatniks.
Okay.
And by the end of the day, they had their story. Spent a day on that.
4 days left, boys.
Yeah. Now, Corman was really unsure of how to direct comedy. He'd never done it before and was like really nervous about it. And Charles Griffith came from like a vaudeville family. So he gave him the advice to just direct it as a straight horror picture. Direct all the actors to give straight performances, play it all serious, and just let the script take care of the jokes.
That's a bold move.
So filming began May 11th, 1959. So, it ended May 16th, 1959. But as filming began, Corman found himself energized by the production. He was, in fact, having fun. And the set was like, reportedly, a very fun place to work. Like this energy of like, oh, let's just like have fun with it kind of permeated the set. And it wasn't the like standard, salt mine gulag that like a lot of Roger Corman sets were.
Oh my goodness. So he's really cooking.
Yeah. The lead actor in this film is regular Roger Corman character actor Dick Miller. And he is playing the role of Walter Paisley. And he would go on to play Walter Paisley something like 7 more times. Not the exact character, but like Dick Miller, appeared in all these Corman films. So the generation of directors who grew up on those movies, like Steven Spielberg and Joe Dante, would cast Miller in their movies as like a reference to those old Corman movies. And then people who liked Joe Dante or Steven Spielberg movies casted Miller as a reference to those things. And that's how his career went. And so in these later castings in his career that were like very much based on like, wink, wink, it's Dick Miller, his character would be named Walter Paisley like over and over again, basically as an in-joke.
Okay.
Now, Dick Miller, we've talked about him before, but he's the lead actor in this one, so I figured I'd give a little bit about him again. He was born on Christmas Day, 1928, in the Bronx, and he was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. During World War II, he served a tour with the Navy, and after World War II, he got a PhD in psychology from New York University.
Holy shit.
Yeah, especially given that, like, the persona that Dick Miller has as
It's
a
so
character
blue
actor.
collar.
Yes, it's like the most blue collar guy. But yeah, PhD in psychology. In 1952, he moved out to California to be a writer. He was not finding a lot of success with that. He was running out of money, so he started acting, like as an extra. His first film was Roger Corman's Apache Woman in 1955, where he plays both a Native American character and a white townsfolk character. And in the final battle, his townsfolk character kills his native character with a gun, like in the battle scene. By 1959, Dick Miller had appeared in 11 movies. So 11 movies in 4 years. All of those movies were directed by Roger Corman. But Bucket of Blood was actually the first time he was going to have a leading role. Like, this is a guy whose past roles included like door-to-door vacuum salesman.
Yeah. Who would have like a scene.
Right. Probably the reason why he finally got to have a lead role is just how low this movie's budget was. Like, by 1959, you didn't have actors on studio contracts anymore. You couldn't loan people. Like, all the actors are making their own deals, and they're starting to become, you know, a lot more expensive to get a name. Now, Miller was excited about the opportunity, obviously. He felt that the script was good. The humor was good. He liked his co-stars. He felt Corman really directed the hell out of the movie. And he felt the movie was like hitting at the right time to be topical. That basically it had all the makings of a classic, but for one thing, the low budget, which severely disappointed him due to the low production values it resulted in. So there's just, you know, he felt that if Corman had realized just like what a good movie he had on his hands and maybe spent, you know, a little more money on things like makeup and special effects, then the movie could have been like much more than it is. Now, Miller's co-star in this film, Barboura Morris, was a 27-year-old LA native who was also a Corman regular. This was her 7th picture in the past 2 years, all of which were Roger Corman movies. And she had just divorced her husband, theater director Monty Hellman, and during shooting on this picture, she began a brief affair with Corman. Later in her career, she turned to writing and became involved with the New Left movement. I think her most famous piece of writing is something where she accuses Nixon of like conspiring to have this person murdered.
Didn't he do that?
So, actor Ed Nelson had produced and starred in The Brain Eaters the year before, after a long stretch just doing like stunts for Corman. So he appears here. And 71-year-old actress Myrtle Vale, who appears in this film, had been a vaudeville and radio star in the 1930s and was also Charles Griffith's grandmother. So that's how she got that part.
Nepotism.
Corman brought the movie in under budget at $35,000
Oh.
in 5 days.
Oh my God.
And he would later shoot Little Shop of Horrors in 2 days on the same sets for $27,500. So like what was left in the budget and schedule from this movie was what was used to do Little Shop of Horrors.
Wow.
AIP, instead of complaining about how Corman had conned them, hey, you got comedy in my horror picture. They actually embraced it and structured the entire marketing around promoting the movie as a black comedy. And they had like a poster featuring like Addams Family-esque characters attending the movie in like various like one-panel comics. kind of thing.
Neat.
That give like no hints to what the movie's actually about, basically.
It's about a bucket of blood.
Exactly. AIP even ran a gag promotion where they said that customers who brought an actual bucket of blood to the theater could get in free. Nobody did this.
Yeah. Carry wasn't a thing yet, so no one knew where to get a bucket of blood.
Right. They just totally went with this kind of like Mad Magazine, like, yeah, it's comedy kind of thing. The movie debuted on October 21st, 1959, and it made $150,000.
Yeah, that's a good date.
Yeah.
That's a really good date for this.
So it made,
a ton of money.
Yeah, like
just all the bread.
3 times its original budget. And it was also critically well received. Variety said that it had too much comedy to be horror and too much horror to be comedy, but that it was sure to be a hit either way. Dick Miller got very good reviews for his performance, which was considered to have like a lot of pathos. Cahiers de Cinema viewed the movie as Corman's self-portrait within the film industry. Where he is this struggling artist who doesn't have like the resources to make good art and just has to like make do with what he has, and is, a slave to a wider kind of nonsense art world that doesn't understand him and just like uses him for profit. Cahiers de Cinema saw this as like an autobiographical movie.
Wild.
Others noted that its satire of Beatniks felt more authentic than bigger studio pictures about the same subculture. So yeah, this movie got good critical reviews and was financially successful. The success of Bucket of Blood inspired Corman and Griffiths to continue to explore black comedy, notably in Little Shop of Horrors, but also led to them like inserting more of a tongue-in-cheek attitude into their other movies as well, which kind of then started to tie in with the 60s cultural movement towards like camp.
Yes.
And stuff like that.
Poking fun at like the genre as well.
Exactly. Where like you're doing a horror movie, but like you are also making fun of horror movies at the same time. Now, Bucket of Blood was never copyrighted because Corman just didn't think these movies were going to last. He figured they'd play at the drive-in for, a couple months and then they'd get thrown in the trash and no one would want to talk about them in 50 years. So he never bothered with paying to have them copyrighted. So, it is fully in the public domain. As the years went on and it got this like cult classic reputation, Corman actually went on this little spree in the late 80s, early 90s of like remaking some of his old movies, or at least producing remakes of some of his old movies. With this, Corman produced a TV movie remake in 1995 starring Anthony Michael Hall in the Dick Miller role. It was directed by Michael McDonald. And the point of these remakes that he did at that time was to like try and get some thing under that, hit movie from the 50s title that he actually had the rights to and could make money off of. So we're going to be watching A Bucket of Blood on YouTube. For physical media, my recommendation is that you go with the Olive Signature Edition Blu-ray from 2019.
Well, folks, if you want to join us on the fun, you can find our YouTube playlist on our website, screamscenepodcast.com. You're going to hear a brief musical interlude, and when we come back, we will discuss A Bucket of Blood from 1959, directed by Roger Corman.
Take it away, Daddy-O.
It'll be a gas. Welcome back to Scream Scene. We just finished watching A Bucket of Blood from 1959, directed by Roger Cool Cat Corman. What did you think, Ben? What are your first thoughts?
This is just legitimately a good movie.
I really enjoyed this.
Yeah.
I think people should watch this movie.
The Bucket of Blood is not a major or significant element in the movie at all, but it is there.
It is there, which is better than some movies.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is good. I think it's a good movie.
I don't know if you want to get into this in the discussion, but one quote that you gave from a critic was that like it was too comedic to be horror and too horror to be comedy.
Right.
What do you think?
I think that's something we're going to have to hash out in the discussion. But what I will say about that critic comment, which like really expressed a lot of like the feelings around this movie at the time, is I think a lot of that comes from the fact that like black humor like this, macabre humor like this was not common in the culture in 1959.
Whereas we live in a post-Young Frankenstein world.
I mean, we live in a post like we live in a post Addams Family world, but we also like just like our comedy has pushed so many boundaries that I think that from a modern perspective, no one would bat an eyelash at this movie. And I don't mean that in the way of like, oh, well, it's not edgy. I mean that in the way of like, no one would be confused about what this movie is trying to do.
Yeah. Well, to clear up any other confusion, let me go through the synopsis. So for the most part, we are set at the Yellow Door Cafe, and we follow a busboy named Walter Paisley, who wants to be a beat artist. Maxwell Brock is a poet, and when we come into the film, he's performing, and Walter really looks up to Maxwell, and that part of that is because Maxwell espouses the philosophy of the Beat Generation.
First line in the movie is, "Let us talk about art, for there is nothing else to talk about."
Yeah, it's really like spot on to a hilarious extent. Maxwell also says how the artist is the only thing that is alive. It is a moral good to be an artist, and the world must sustain the artist.
Yeah, like the role of everyone who's not an artist is to be like either the subject for an artist or like the support for an artist in some way.
Now, Walter has ordered some clay to become a sculptor, but he doesn't actually know what he's doing. But, you know, he's giving it his best shot. We have heard that his landlady's cat, Frankie, is missing, and, you know, he hears Frankie stuck in the wall, because, you know, cats be getting stuck in walls.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Walter isn't the sharpest tool in the shed, so to help Frankie out of the drywall, he goes and he takes a knife and he puts it through the wall and stabs and kills Frankie. He is sad about it, he is remorseful, and he decides he's going to return Frankie to his landlady in the morning. But when he wakes up, he gets this like burst of creativity and decides that for this cat to be immortal, I will encase it in clay.
Yeah, I think this really comes from like the whole Maxwell thing of like other people are just like grist for the mill of art kind of thing, where it's like, oh, well, the cat's death won't be in vain if it's for art.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he creates a sculpture with the clay around the cat body and the knife and names it Dead Cat. Now he brings it to the cafe, and the piece is a really big hit, particularly with Carla, who also works at the cafe, and Walter has a pretty big crush on. We do see that there are some cops undercover at the cafe, because this is, you know, a wretched hive of scum and villainy.
I mean, to be fair, like they're trying to catch heroin dealers, and there's definitely heroin dealers in this cafe.
I'm just saying.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's some cops undercover at this cafe. One of them is named Lou, and he happens to see as an admirer of Walter's work named Neolia, goes up to Walter and she's like, "You're so creative. I just want to be with you." And Walter's like, no, thank you. She's like, "But there must be something good I must do for you." And she decides to give him a vial of heroin. Now, Walter doesn't really know what that is. He's just like, "Oh, what is this?" Okay, and puts it in his pocket and leaves. Lou follows him home and then confronts Walter like, "Hey, I see you have heroin. You're going to tell me who you sell this to. You're going to tell me who your contact is, all these things. And Walter's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what this is. Lou goes to arrest him, and Walter is holding up a frying pan in defense, like, no, don't shoot me, don't hurt me, and hits Lou over the head with the frying pan and breaks open his skull.
Mm-hmm.
The bucket of blood comes from Walter's landlady being like, hey, Walter, I'm hearing some weird noises. And Walter quickly hides the body in like the roof in the kitchen.
Yeah, like in the rafters.
And once he gets the landlady out, Lou's arm kind of like falls down and is bleeding. So Walter puts a bucket underneath, like as if his roof is leaking.
Yeah.
And it slowly fills up with a getting stronger stream of blood.
Yeah.
As Walter's like, what the fuck am I going to do with a body? I know, clay, yada yada. Meanwhile, the owner of the cafe, Leonard, bumps into the cat that has been on display, and it falls down and it breaks open a little bit. And he sees that there is fur underneath. And he puts two and two together and he's like, oh shit, Walter killed a cat and encased it in clay. This isn't good. I need to go tell the police. And as he's on his way, someone comes up to him and is like, hey, I'll buy that piece for $100. And he's like, no, where's a dime? I need to call the police. And the guy's like, fine, you drive a hard bargain, $500. And Leonard's like, $500, huh? Interesting.
Which is like $5,000 nowadays.
I mean, if someone offered me $500 for a sculpture, I would absolutely take that money.
Yeah, so if someone offered you $5,000 for a sculpture?
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Now, this means that Leonard is particularly concerned when Walter comes in and says that he has a new piece. And he brings Leonard and Carla over to his flat to see it, and it is named The Murdered Man. Leonard is like, oh God, oh fuck, oh God. Listen, Walter, you really got to stop making realistic pieces. Maybe you should turn to freeform? And Carla and everyone else is like, no, like you can't stifle his creativity. Like he's an artist. You can't tell him what he has to do next.
Yeah, everyone thinks that these, murder sculptures are brilliant.
Just the most amazing things. His grasp of human anatomy, right. Benjamin. Now that evening, someone comes into the cafe. Her name is Alice. And she has just gotten back from a vacation, so she hasn't heard about Walter's sculptures or anything. And she kind of just mocks him. She's like, no, you'll never be more than a busboy. Like, you're just some guy. Your sculptures are shit. And Walter doesn't like that. So he follows her home and says, like, well, how about you be my model for the next sculpture? And so he kills her and turns her into his next piece. Strangled woman. And I mean, he's very on the nose with the names, right? Like,
yeah, no, for sure. But like, it is very funny, like how those are just like the perfect names for these sculptures, though. Like you can totally buy that is how the art world would respond. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like that someone would be like, that you would make a statue of a strangled woman and then call it Strangled Woman. And then someone would be like, that's brilliant.
And then one night coming home from the cafe, he's like, oh man. And so he's drunk at this point. He's like, oh man, like everyone loves my shit. I'm so hip. Isn't this great? And they're all asking like, what am I going to do next? Oh God, what am I going to do next? And he passes by a carpenter working very late hours. Walter starts saying like, but you see, like people serve the artist. Mm-hmm. It's a moral good for them to do so. And so he dismembers the carpenter and thus creates a bust of a headless man, I think is what he calls that one.
Or is it like the severed head? Or something
maybe,
like that.
It might be the severed head.
It's pretty wild. He basically severs this guy's head with the like buzz saw that he's using to like cut wood.
And he shows this bust to Leonard in the morning as Leonard is overhearing a nearby newsie being like, extra, carpenter dismembered down street.
Yeah.
Head missing.
Yeah, exactly.
So Leonard is like, Walter, please, I need you to not be doing any more sculptures, please. I'm starting to feel responsible. And the reason he feels responsible is because he told Walter he would eventually do an art show for his work. So he's like, okay, well, let's host that party then. And then no more sculptures,
Yeah.
okay? Please. And Walter's like, that sounds great. It's the night of the event. And Walter goes over to Carla's place where she's living in a commune, basically, with all of the other Beat generation. And he walks over to the party with her because he has this really big crush on her. Since he's started being a sculptor, Carla has been like super praising of his work and his talent. And she even like kissed him at one point because she was so like amazed by his talent. So he's like, yeah, I think you love me and I think we should get married so I can stop being a sculptor. And so she lets him down easy.
But he takes it pretty hard.
He takes it pretty hard. And so he's like, well, then just let me at least make a sculpture out of you. And she's like, oh, I would be so honored and happy for you to do that. Not thinking, oh no, I will be dead.
Yeah, the thing I love about Walter, so it's really clear that he really only wants to be an artist to get Carla's approval, right? Which is why it's like, oh,
and
well,
Maxwell's.
Yeah, but it's like if Carla marries him, he doesn't have to be an artist anymore, right?
Yeah.
But what I love about the way that he talks about making people into statues is he never like lies to anyone. Like that's the phraseology he uses, like, I'll make you into a statue. And, you know, people just take that to mean like, I'll be the model for the statue that you will make. But he means it totally literally. And yeah, I just kind of, there's something almost charming about Walter's kind of lack of awareness of what he's doing.
It's funny that you say lack of awareness because a running gag throughout the film is Maxwell being like, well, you're just not aware. You're just not aware about art and the world.
Yeah.
And you're just not aware. So they head to the party. And while there, Carla notices that there's some clay coming off of Alice's hand and that there's a real hand underneath. And so she freaks out and starts to go towards the phone to call the police. And Walter's like, Carla, are you okay? And she's like, Walter, there's a body in your sculpture. And he's like, yeah, no, that's Alice. She's the strangled woman. She's my sculpture. And she's like, get the fuck away from me, and starts running down the street. And he starts running after her. Other patrons, including Leonard, the other cop whose name I didn't catch, and the poet Maxwell, also notice that there are bodies in these sculptures.
And they start breaking them apart.
Yeah, well, because the other cop recognizes that it's Lou.
Yeah.
And so then they go chasing after Walter. As Walter is chasing down Carla, he begins to hear like these voices in his head. And they're the voices of the people who he murdered, saying like, Walter, you can't hide from us. You should just go home. And like, there's no point. Just go home. And so he eventually stops chasing Carla in kind of like this like manic mode and starts heading home just as like the cops catch up to where Carla is and then following Walter to his house. Once alone in his house, Walter's like, well, they're coming after me. I don't know what to do. The voices keep getting louder. And he's like, I know, I'll go where they can't find me. And then just as everyone arrives into his flat, they find him hanged with clay on his face. And Maxwell says something poetic, like, he would have called this the Hanged Man, I suppose. His most magnificent work.
Yeah.
The end. So it's very much like Mystery of the Wax Museum, as you said at the beginning. It has some vibes that were from a Rondo Hatton flick that we watched. I think it was called House of Horrors.
Yeah.
Because it also had a sculptor. Yeah, sculptors making weird shit that are like demonic or evil or dead
We've
bodies.
been to this well a few times.
Even going back to like The Magician in 1926. Like it's a tried and true path. So it wasn't like a huge surprise here. And I think they did a fairly good job here.
So yeah, like the writing for this movie is very good.
Yes.
It is on point satire. If you know nothing about Beatniks, like you don't know anything about Jack Kerouac or nothing, I think as long as you've spent any amount of time in any kind of like insular indie arts community, you will recognize every character in this movie.
It's so eerie,
Like,
how accurate some of this shit is.
It's accurate to, like, it's an accurate skewering of the Beatniks, but if you updated the lingo, it would be, you could do this for hippies, you could do this for like punks, you could do this for basically like any major arts related counterculture movement. You know, if this came out in 2009, it would be like the indie folk rock scene. You know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely.
these guys would be talking about how, like, oh, he's much better live, you know, like, and yeah, like the fact that it's so on point and so apt, helps a lot with the dialogue, because I feel like the number one failing of a lot of these like sensationalistic, like, ooh, the teens, is that the attempt at teen slang from adult writers almost always sounds terrible.
Yeah.
And I was not there in 1959. I do not know if anyone talked like this in 1959. But being someone who, you know, had his own period of like slang and like my age group's slang, the way people talk in this sound like the way people talk. Like, it sounds like legitimate uses of slang language rather than just some like rando nonsense coming from like an old trying to seem young.
Even down to the performances we see. So we see Maxwell perform poetry twice. We see 2 musical performances. The first one being like a guy with a guitar being like, murderers are terrible people.
But also kind of cool because I'm singing about them.
And Walter's just like, yeah, I didn't just murder a guy and turn him into a statue. I don't know. It was like legitimately good stuff. Like the stuff Maxwell was saying, like it fit both the beat generation, it fit any kind of insular art movement and what that ethos tends to be. It also made sense for the movie.
Yeah, it fit the themes.
Yeah, it was like, yeah, it hit the perfect trifecta of all of those.
Yeah, like the writing is just very good. It's very good satire. You can tell that these are people who know Beatniks, who are skewering them.
And like, shout out to the actors who would be playing the Beatniks here. Like, I mean, from the people who are playing like the bum version of Beatniks all the way up to Maxwell playing the like, is this organic?
Yes.
Kind of level of like, art person.
That is a joke.
He
in
literally
the movie.
says, yeah.
But yeah, like the
Are these
druggy
eggs
guys.
fertilized?
The druggy guys
Yes.
like feel totally on point. Like they don't feel like a weird caricature of, you know, drug users. They feel like, no, like I've met guys like that. Like I have 100% met guys like that.
And then there's even people in the cafe who are like squares.
Yes.
Who are not part of this movement, who are here because they are being basically tourists.
Yeah.
And they mock them too. Like, it's really well done.
It's so apt. The other thing that the movie gets really right is the character psychology of Walter.
Yeah, I was very impressed with that and very impressed with Dick Miller's performance.
Yeah, Walter's lonely. He's ignored. He's ostracized. He's a romantic dreamer. He has kind of a loose grip on reality, and he's like fixated on, like, you know, he wants Carla to like him. He also wants just like everyone's approval. He keeps killing and making these sculptures because he thinks that, you know, if he stops, this is the only thing that makes people like him.
Yeah.
And if he stops doing it, they'll forget about him and stop liking him. Again, if this was a modern movie, we would call him like an incel type, right? Like,
sure.
He's red-pilled, man. Like,
well, I feel like you're using some politically charged language there. I would say that, like, when he's on stage and they're celebrating him and Maxwell gives, like, a poem about, like, everyone knows that Walter has been born.
Right.
Because of, like, his soul is pure because of his art.
Yeah.
It really reminded me of that scene in Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Oh, yeah.
When Quasimodo is being held up. And
I think that's totally on purpose because they do the thing where, like, when they have this party in Walter's honor, they give him, like, the crown and like the little thing, like fake scepter to hold. And it's the exact like King of Fools thing.
Yeah.
So I think you're like, you're meant to be drawing those comparisons. And yeah, like I think the writing here is really on the mark for, if you want to understand where like incel serial killers are coming from. But also, like you said, Dick Miller gives this great performance. And I think the thing that he and the directing do that's really like walking a fine tightrope is making Walter believable,
yes,
likable, and pitiable. Like you understand why he is the way he is. You kind of feel sorry for him. You feel sympathy for him. He's kind of, you can't really hate him because he's kind of like, he doesn't really know what he's doing. And the movie somehow manages to make Walter kind of bumbling his way into murdering some people and then deciding that the thing to do would be to encase them in clay. Like the movie somehow makes that train of thought seem logical multiple times
and slightly endearing.
Yeah, and like exactly,
at least until he goes and like actively kills then. Like once he kills Alice, then it's like, okay, no, like we're in my opinion, horror movie territory. But when it was just like, no, get away from me, whack with the pan, oh no, a dead body, what should I do? I know.
Yeah, and Miller's performance as Walter somehow manages to make like the naivete of the character believable, of this like, well, I turned him into sculptures. Like,
I will say, we looked this up. Dick Miller is 31 in this movie. I believe his character is supposed to be at most 25. And so that's the, like, I would say.
Well, so Walter has his own apartment.
Yeah.
And he's kind of supposed to be like a loser. And it is one of those things of like, the character to me came across as like young, primarily because of the way that he's like this naive busboy working this minimum wage job, like looking up to the artists and stuff. But if he is meant to be in his 30s, I think that still works because I think it reinforces the fact that like his character is meant to be kind of a little mentally challenged.
Sure, I see what you're saying. I guess for me, it's like, I don't read Dick Miller as the age that Walter is supposed to be.
I mean, I don't even read him as 31. I'm 32 and I'm looking at this guy and I'm like, yeah, that guy's in his 40s, right?
Right. Like, part of it is
problem.
like, my first encounter with Dick Miller is him as an old person.
Yeah.
Right? In Deep Space Nine. And he looks exactly the same here, just his wrinkles aren't as deep,
Yeah, well, yeah, it's like, he doesn't have the wrinkles and his hair's not gray, but he's the same guy.
Yeah,
right?
his voice is a little lighter.
Yeah.
Which is really, I think he does a really good job.
No, absolutely. And I think his character actor strengths really help him here in, getting across how awkward and, inside himself Walter is, because I think a more traditional leading actor would probably have been tempted to make Walter a little more normal.
Yes.
Whereas Miller like gives him a lot of like weird sort of, tics, and the way he walks and the way he kind of goes about things, where you can like tell that, yeah, this guy's, supposed to be fitting this archetype of this kind of like loser guy.
I think people might have also been tempted, people as in like other directors or writers would have been tempted to make this role into a straight man to the Beatniks.
Right.
And that would have made this film not work at all.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think works really well here is we can sympathize with Walter's, desire for Carla to accept him and love him. But the movie never tries to put us on his side about it. Like, it's clear that, for one thing, Carla's not interested, but also, like, when he's trying to pursue her, that, like, he's in the wrong. There isn't any confusion about that.
Yeah. The active camera was really awesome. We had a lot of really fantastic lighting and dynamic lighting.
Yeah, for something shot in 5 days, Corman and the cinematographer Jacques Marquette really knock it out of the park here.
Like, there were moments even during like the chase scene that they were finding ways to make it more dynamic than just, okay, cameras up, everyone run past. Okay, set up in another location, everyone run past. There's even a few like close-up reactions during the chase that they would have had to like, okay, let us reset up to be a close-up. All right, we're ready, go.
Yeah, the movie looks great. The direction is spot on. The chase scene, like you pointed out, like they find ways to do depth and dynamics in the space, but also like the movie does a lot of really clever stuff, like how in the first murder scene, when Walter kills the cat, he's hearing the cat meowing and he goes to get the knife and he bonks his head on like the overhead light in his apartment on his way into the kitchen, which sends it like swinging wildly around, which then gives the scene this very like dramatic lighting where things go from, you know, in light to in shadow as the light moves, that fits the like dramatic nature of the scene of this like, oh shit, I've, you know, killed the cat, but was motivated by like kind of a goofy slapstick moment, right?
Absolutely. Even when like he takes the cat and puts it on the table, the position of a mirror in that scene means that when Walter moves, then suddenly we see this dead animal, like full on, just like moments like that.
Yeah, like Corman knows what he's doing here. It's really clear. Like this is not something where, well, they threw a bunch of stuff together really fast and accidentally ended up with something good. No, like this was done on purpose.
Yeah, I think it was the right call to have Corman shoot this straight. And I think Corman has far more directing talent than he gives himself credit for.
Absolutely. The argument that Cahiers de Cinema made about this movie was basically that Corman is Walter.
Yeah.
And like, you know, that he is, which oddly I think makes Cahiers de Cinema Maxwell. But but the argument was that like Leonard was AIP.
Yeah.
Like these guys who don't really understand what this person is doing, but are willing to make money off it, right?
I can see where they're coming, but as is often the case with some critics, sometimes you just need to take a step back and rethink your analogy a little bit. But
right.
I do like the idea of, like, Walter doesn't see the value in his work. He's like, yeah, I made a cat. You like it? You really think it's good?
Yeah, he doesn't believe it.
Yeah, and people are like, no, you have talent. And I feel like that fits Roger Corman a bit. He's like, well, overnight I made this movie in a fucking week.
Yeah, because that's the other thing about Walter that's like Roger Corman is everyone's like, how did you make an entire sculpture in a night? And I mean, it's because he's just taking bodies and covering them in clay. But like that's Roger Corman, right? It's like, how did you make this movie in a week? And it's like, oh, because
under budget.
I took some old sets from a movie that had just wrapped up shooting and some actors who were hanging around, and I just threw something together.
Yeah, and it's like, this is really good, Roger. I mean, part of it too, for why I'm like kind of side-eyeing the Cahiers du Cinema's perspective is because I side-eye auteur theory. Because
sure.
As you said, the writing makes this movie work, and Roger didn't write this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my only real complaint about this movie is similar to Dick Miller's complaint about this movie, which is it's a shame that the prop statues aren't more convincing. I do think that like the faces done for them are pretty good and like honestly are believable that the art world would be like, oh, what a unique piece. But the bodies are mannequins and really clearly mannequins. And the cat statue, you can tell like what the writer was going for in the script because the dialogue is still people being like, look how realistic it is. And look how you can see the reflection. And like clearly what the writer was thinking in his head was like that the, you know, clay over top the body would be sort of very form fitting, I guess, like very one-to-one, you know.
Whereas these, besides the faces, look a little bit more like Pompeii figures.
Yeah, yeah.
I definitely see what you're saying, but there is some kind of like, of course Beatniks would be like, oh, this is like an amazing thing. and it's actually not good at all.
Sure.
You know?
The other thing that Miller felt was a shame, and I agree with him, is that I guess the final shot wasn't really given the time that he felt it should have needed. He was supposed to be like, his face was supposed to be covered in clay, but they didn't have time to apply the clay. So I guess what happened was they just put gray makeup on his face, which the problem with that then is, as the lighting in the shot shifts, sometimes you can see it, but sometimes you can't because it's a black and white movie, and it doesn't really get across the idea that he's encased himself in the clay very well. And so the final shot of him hanging doesn't quite land with, I think, the horror intended. And Miller felt like, that's your last shot in the movie. Like, you should fucking spend time on it. But it was very much a kind of like, well, no, that's all the time we have. We got to wrap. We got to get on to the next thing.
That's the thing, though. You didn't have to wrap.
Yeah.
You had a few more days.
Yeah. He got it in under time and under budget, which does make Miller's complaints about Corman kind of cutting himself off at the kneecaps with his sort of miserliness, like, ring a little true, right? Where it's like, you had a low budget and you brought it in for even less than that. Like, you could have, spared a dime here or there.
One last thing I need to say about this movie. Our major complaint about 4D Man being the music?
Right.
It works so well here.
Yes.
And I think it's because of the Beatniks scene.
Yeah.
Like, we're explicitly dealing with this jazzy subculture. So the fact that the entire movie is scored that way fits so well.
Absolutely.
Whereas 4D Man, it was like out of nowhere. We work in a factory. Why is there like a saxophone going ham? So I feel like we're ready to transition into the thing I brought up earlier. Is this too horror to be comedy and too comedic to be horror?
This, I think, from a 2023 perspective, in my opinion, this is a comedy. And I think genre confusion about this movie exists because of the fact that this kind of movie didn't really exist in 1959. But if you compare this to like Death Becomes Her, or like So I Married an Axe Murderer and stuff like that, I think it hits a similar note. It does have some effective pure horror moments, like when Walter goes after Carla in the finale. But I think that comes from the fact that Corman is shooting the movie straight. He's lighting it and directing it and shooting it like a horror movie. But the performances and the script make it clear that this is a comedy. And I think that, if you had a different actor playing Walter, like if Walter was played by like Crispin Glover instead of Dick Miller, or someone like that, that would make it more horror, because Walter would kind of go from like lovable doofus to like sincerely creepy in an interesting way. But in my opinion, I think this is a comedy. It's just a comedy that people weren't used to in 1959. Like it's a black comedy. But I am willing to hear an argument that it's enough horror to rank if you feel strongly.
So I feel like this is horror. It's definitely comedic horror. But the fact that the emphasis was constantly on where is the violence, and the way that like someone stumbles into violence is very funny. If it had just stayed that way, then yeah, it's a comedy. But when he turns to killing Carla, and then when he goes after the carpenter, just like some random dude who's working late hours because he's maybe not unionized, like I think that's when it's like, no, this is a horror movie. Absolutely.
I think it at the very least, it shows that Corman understands that the line between comedy and horror is very thin, and it's all in how you kind of frame it, because, it's the same function of, it's the same formula of like setup, release. It's just, in one, the release is a laugh and the other is a scream. We've talked about this before.
Yeah, and even just thinking about the carpenter scene, like it's like, oh no, he's shoving that guy's neck into the saw. And then the next thing we see is, here's my severed headpiece, and Leonard's horror at like, oh god, this is the carpenter we just heard about.
Yeah.
As like,
but like that scene is funny. That's a comedy scene.
Yes, but we're also there with Leonard's like when he's like, I'm feeling responsible. Like you can kind like
it's both. Like it's black comedy and you know, Leonard is legitimately horrified, but the actor plays the reactions broad enough for them to be comedy reactions. And then the way he turns around and is like, you know, okay, we're gonna do the show for Walter so that can be his grand finale, and then it's done. But like he's still making money off this show, right? I do think there is a bit of a switch in tone in the movie when he kills the model and
Alice,
onwards. Yeah, from Alice onwards, because Alice is the first one killed with malice.
Yeah, I think earlier I said Carla. I meant when he kills Alice.
Yeah, because it's Alice and then the carpenter and then the attempt on Carla.
Yes.
Yeah, and there is definitely a switch there.
We probably could have held a little longer for the fear and horror for the patrons when they realize what's in the sculptures.
Yeah.
But we hear screams, we get a close-up of the bus girl freaking out and people like running around and stuff, like getting into action.
And I suspect that the fact that we don't really hold on that scene very long has less to do with like, well, but this is a comedy, and more to do probably with the fact that like, given how they did the sculptures as like mannequins and stuff, they didn't have the time, money, know-how to do like a shot of like cracking apart a clay sculpture and there being like a dead body inside, which would be a really horrific sight. Like they just don't have the ability to do it. So it's like, oh, we'll just have everyone scream and cut to the next thing. And that's not we'll spare the audience the horror. That's just, I didn't have the money.
Yeah.
And
well,
time.
I think the fact that they aren't worried about sparing the audience is really hit home when at the end, like the final scene is us on Walter's dead hanged face.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
And like the bars even change to make it vertical and then they go back to widescreen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they vignette it, which is super rare. Very visually effective. Like, again, like Corman knows what he's doing here. Like, this is not an accident.
Yeah. And so for those reasons, I believe that this is horror. It's definitely still comedy, but I think this is horror and I think it ranks.
Okay, you think there's enough in here to rank it? Well, where were you looking then?
Well, I'm worried, Ben.
Okay. I do have a little range picked out in case you manage to talk me into it.
Well, I looked at our highest ranking Roger Corman movie, which is It Conquered the World in 1956, which is that Conquered the World?
Yeah, I was just...
That's how I remember that one.
Yeah.
I think this is way better.
Yeah.
Because it's been 3 years. Roger Corman has 50 films under his belt by now. He has grown so much as a director.
Yeah, it's just a better made movie, period. Yeah.
And the writing as well. The movie It Conquered the World had good writing. That's always been Corman's saving grace, I think. Even for the ones that we've watched of his that didn't rank.
Yeah.
I think A Bucket of Blood is better than that.
Yeah.
Looking up, so that's at 83.
Okay.
Looking up, my eyes came to Dementia at 70 from 1955.
Right.
And this felt very similar in that way of low budget. Yeah.
Sure. Shadowy 1950s alleyways.
And an emphasis on being in the club and stuff. Dementia is far more nightmarish.
Yeah.
So I was okay, well, it's not going above Dementia. The other thing that is over here is our favorite friend, Vampire Cowboy, Curse of the Undead,
right?
Which is another genre blend. And I was torn because Vampire Cowboy, you get it. Beatnik, serial killer sculptor. How much of that do you need to have a context for what the Beatniks are and stuff? Whereas Vampire Cowboy, you got it.
The thing about Curse of the Undead is that, and I probably said this in the episode, but structurally, it's much more a Western than it is a horror because it's, the bad gunslinger in town and we gotta, have the good gunslinger come in and defend the ranch and blah, 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 right? Whereas I think Bucket of Blood, because Corman's done horror before, and also because they picked a specific horror movie to kind of hang the trimmings on.
Yeah.
The structure here is horror movie. The structure is horror. The emphasis is comedy, right? Whereas I think Curse of the Undead, the structure was Western and the emphasis was horror. So I'm honestly inclined to say if this thing is going on the list, it should go above Curse of the Undead.
Okay. Now, because I know some folks might yell about it, The Tingler from Castle is below that at 74. I think Bucket of Blood is better because I was disappointed by The Tingler. I feel like above Curse of the Undead, but below Dementia and below The Abominable Snowman, which is below Dementia, is probably a really good spot.
So I'm just going to briefly tell you where my range was.
Yeah.
Although what I will say is I'm going to come to your range because I sort of don't think this should have ranked and your range is lower than mine. So I'd rather err on the side of caution and rank this a little lower. I ranked this up in the 50s.
Interesting.
My range was 56 to 59. And the reason that happened is instead of going looking for Corman, I went looking for where is Mystery of the Wax Museum and House of Wax. And I found House of Wax at 59. And I like this movie better than House of Wax. I think this movie is smarter than House of Wax. I think this movie has more going for it than House of Wax. And then I basically made my way up and saw The Screaming Skull at 55, which is not as well made as this movie, but is much more of a horror movie than this movie.
Yeah, I'm going to have to say I feel good about you coming down because like House of Wax...
Well, at the end of the day, even if I think this is a better movie, House of Wax is a better horror movie.
Yeah.
And that's the standard by which we rank things on this list.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, looking at where you want this, I'm totally cool with putting this above Curse of the Undead and below The Abominable Snowman.
Yeah, and the reason why I feel like it shouldn't go above Abominable Snowman is because of the level of like controlled tension that movie manages to have. Because the thing about both comedy and horror is that management of that tension, right? Both involve a release, but how long can you hold it? How long can you edge?
Sure. So yeah, but I agree with you for the same reasons.
Yeah, okay.
So entering the list at the new number 72 is A Bucket of Blood from 1959, directed by Roger Corman.
If you would like to see this list, you can go to our website, screamscenepodcast.com. There you can find links to the many episodes that we have mentioned today, as well as our appeals box. If you would like to contest this or any other ranking, you can drop us a line through our Ask box on Tumblr. You can reach out over email at screamscenepodcast@gmail.com or over Twitter @_screamscene.
Scream Scene updates every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spotify. Leaving the show a rating or a review helps the show be promoted by algorithms. If you want to bypass algorithms, you can tell a friend about the show, post about it on social media. If you want to make sure you never miss an episode, you can subscribe to our RSS feed. And if you want to help the show out financially, you can do that by heading on to patreon.com/screamscenepodcast. We really appreciate all the support we get through there.
Yes.
That helps us with, putting the show on every week, hosting cost, but also just like the time that we put in. It's just really nice. If you join at the $1 a month level, you'll get thanked on the show. If you join at $5 a month, you're going to get regular bonus audio. And if you join at $10 a month, you're going to get like all kinds of stuff, essays and short stories. And it's mostly writing. Writing is what you get at $10 a month. But patrons of any level get to vote in our monthly polls to determine what our horror adjacent bonus episode will be that month. This month's is Them. But April's poll is still up and still running. Last I checked, Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man was in the lead. It's a selection of horror comedies, you see.
It is very tight between Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man and the 1939 The Cat and the Canary.
Interesting. Okay, so are you a Bob Hope person or are you an Abbott and Costello person? Make your voice heard. Join the Patreon. Patreon.com/Scream Scene Podcast.
Well, Ben, what are we watching next week?
Next week, Sarah, we are watching the AIP Roger Corman produced but not directed B movie to this that, played on the same double feature. It's Attack of the Giant Leeches.
Gross. Leeches are gross.
We'll see you next week, Creatures of the Night.
Bye.
Bye.